Okay, hello. My name is Meredith Muth, and I welcome all of you to the Southeast Drought Update Webinar. Okay, it is 1 o'clock and Eastern Time, and we will go ahead and start. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online at drought.gov for you to look at afterwards and to share. Today's overview is to first provide a update on current conditions and impacts on drought in the Southeast. Then we will pivot over to direct impacts on agriculture, and then finally wrap it up with some outlook of what is expected in the future regarding drought in the Southeast. We also wanted to take this unique opportunity, especially since this is our first Southeast Drought Update webinar, to provide some additional resources at the state and regional levels. And we will wrap it up with some question and answers as time allows. If you have any questions as we go through, as the speakers are giving their presentations, please do add those into the question box. If you have questions regarding being able to access and hear the webinar, you can add that message into the chat box as well. And let's begin. Again, this is our very first Southeast Drought Update webinar. I just wanted to take 1 minute to introduce what NIDIS is, the National Integrated Drought Information System, in case you are not familiar with our program and partners. NIDIS, through a mandate from Congress, has a mission to improve the nation's capacity to proactively manage drought-related risks. And a key component of this is to make climate and drought information readily available to decision makers through active partnerships between federal, tribal, state, and local experts. And it is in the spirit that NIDIS is hosting this webinar today to share broadly the most current and updated information on drought and drought impacts in the South.
State of Georgia.
We're fortunate to have with us two excellent speakers who have decades of experience working on drought in the Southeast region. Our first presenter is Victor Murphy from the National Weather Service Southern Region, who will be providing an analysis and update. And I will pass this over to you now, Victor.
Okay, thank you, Meredith. All right, got ahead of myself there, I'm sorry. Okay, so how did we get here? I'm going to do a quick overview of the first 9 months of 2019 with an emphasis, obviously, in the last 6 weeks or so, which is when this flash drought, if you will, began. We'll do a broad look at the impacts, and then Pam Knox from the University of Georgia will do a deeper dive into the specific impacts on agriculture, with this drought being relatively short term or short fuse right now in nature, basically about 6 weeks, maybe perhaps 8 weeks in duration so far. The biggest impacts have been on agriculture. So Pam's going to take a deeper dive at looking at some of the impacts in agriculture on the states that we're covering here. Then I'll come back and do a brief shorter term and longer term outlook for us going forward in time. So let me see here. So basically, this image here shows 120-day percent of normal rainfall. It's effective then in July. You can see by and large the first 6 months of the year, perhaps even 7 months of the year, overall were quite wet for the region. The greens there were basically, you know, above normal rainfall, and the browns or the yellow areas there are the areas with below normal rainfall. So for 120 days, it's a long period of time leading up to the end of July, which is pretty much the end of summer. Most of the area had near normal to above normal rainfall. There were a few pockets of drought or dryness, one there along the Carolina, southeast North Carolina, along the Carolina coast. Of course, ended up being mitigated by Hurricane Dorian about a month later. And the other area of sort of an enhanced area of dryness is over southeast Alabama and the Florida Panhandle. But other than that, things were pretty good, especially considering, you know, it was the last week of July. The end of summer is in sight, and things are looking, should be looking up as far as summer ending and rainfall, the cool fall being around the corner. But unfortunately, as things so often happen when you go into drought, things pretty much turned on a dime. Basically about the first 2 weeks of September. And for some reason, my slides are not advancing here. Okay, so there we are. The map on the left is the last week of July US Drought Monitor, which basically mirrors or shows the last image I showed. You can see basically there, not a whole lot of area of drought in the southeast. It's a little bit of moderate to severe drought in southeast Alabama, like I showed, and also along the outer banks of along the southeast coast there of North Carolina. In general, there's only 6% of the region was in drought, which is D1 or worse, moderate drought or worse. 6% of the region was in drought on July 30th. And actually then we go into Labor Day, which is basically there on the Drought Monitor from September 3rd, which is the image on the right. You can still see there only about 6% of the region was in drought. So actually, Labor Day is sort of the technical end of summer. And here we are at the end of summer, and just a few patches of moderate drought scattered across the Carolinas, Georgia, and into Florida. Once again, things, looking pretty good. But then the drought ramp up started in earnest the first couple of weeks or so of September, going from September 10th on the left to September 17th on the right. You can see the amount of the region in drought nearly doubles from about 6 or 7% up to about 11%. You can see some severe drought, which is a darker brown, that's D2, starting to take hold there across parts of Alabama, Georgia, and into South Carolina. And then the next image here shows the change from middle of September on into the end of September. Here you go. By the following week, September 24th, we now have 40% of the southeast in drought, and we had our first area of extreme drought, or D3, around the Birmingham area. And you see the change there, 40% in drought and moderate drought or worse this week. Previous week, only 11%. So that's the week between September 17th and 24th. And this is when we start seeing the big ramp up. The next drought monitor was released on October 1st. And by this time, the amount of the region in drought hadn't really increased all that much, 44%. But we've now had about 14% of the region in severe drought, D2 or worse. And once again, that's the dark brown areas and the red areas there. So in a couple of weeks' time, you can see lots of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina now, and the Florida Panhandle now ramping up into severe to extreme drought. And severe drought D2 is drought that occurs in general once every 10 years to once every 25 years. And this brings us to today's drought monitor, which got released today. I've got the link for it there on the bottom left. If you want to do a screen capture of it or something, look at your specific state or the region as a whole. We now have 60% of the region in drought, which is moderate drought or worse. That's the definition of drought in the drought monitor. The yellows are considered abnormally dry. It's not considered drought. But anyway, 60% now in drought, and 25% is in severe drought. So we've gone from about maybe 5%, 4% in severe drought to 25% now in severe drought in 2 weeks' time, about a fourfold or 5 to 5-fold increase. You can see the hardest hit areas there are the reds, which is D3. That occurs in general once every 25 years, once every 50 years. And you can see that across portions of the Florida Panhandle, Alabama, Georgia, and into South Carolina. So that's sort of where we're at right now. And so why the sudden ramp up? Obviously, the drought began in the first week or two of September, actually probably right after Labor Day. And this is a 30-day observed rainfall. This is a combination of radar-based estimates plus ground truth from rain gauges. And the blues there are less than ½ inch of rain. So you can see the entire month of September, a lot of Kentucky, Tennessee, portions of inland South Carolina, North Carolina, portions of inland Georgia, lots of Alabama, and lots of the Florida Panhandle had less than a half inch of rainfall. And the lighter areas are actually areas with near zero rainfall. A lot of locations had, less than a tenth of an inch of rainfall for the entire month of September. Worth noting here, you can see this track of heavier precip here off the coast. That's associated with Hurricane Dorian, which tracked up the east coast of the United States that first week of September. And so that heavy rainfall, by and large missed the region, although it did bring some heavier rains to the coast of South Carolina and the coastal sections of North Carolina. And in fact, if I go back one slide, you can see those are the areas that right now are out of drought. So one of the benefits of them catching the outer fringes of Dorian was the rainfall they got with it, the associated rainfall they got with it actually helped ameliorate or mitigate the drought situation. If you recall, back on end of July, early August, southeast North Carolina was one of the few areas that was in drought at the time, but Dorian did take care of that. So the rest of the region did not have any of the rainfall associated with Dorian. So as a result, you had very dry rainfall totals. So this data here is from the National Centers for Environmental Information in Nashville, North Carolina. It just came out a day or two ago, and they compiled their September ranks for all the various states and counties across the United States. And the darkest brown areas there all had record dry Septembers. And this is broken down at the county level, so you can see a lot of counties in Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, just about every single county in the Florida Panhandle, and a lot of other scattered counties across the region did have record dryness for the month of September. So in contrast, you can see the huge gradient that takes place right in through here. Record wetness across North Dakota and Montana, record wetness in southeast Texas. That was associated with the Hurricane Imelda, or Tropical Storm Imelda, which dropped all that rainfall. You can see these huge gradients, these huge differences. A lot of them associated with tropical systems. You can see here where for September, the coastal sections of the Carolinas were near normal or just slightly above normal. That's the impact of Dorian, and the track of Imelda was up in here, up the east coast of Texas. You can see the rainfall associated with that. So anyway, that sort of shows where the driest areas have been. And you can see a lot of record dry conditions across the southeast U.S. and our region during the month of September. So moving forward here, once again, this is from NCEI. We had a total of 6 states across really the southeast U.S. Had record dry Septembers. Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky also, and also West Virginia. Virginia had their second dry September. Tennessee, second dry September. The Carolinas were not quite as wet. I think a lot of that wetness was due to the above normal rainfall along the coast due to Dorian. If you were to take that out, the rest of the state, as we saw, the interior portion of the state actually had bottom 5 to bottom 10 driest, and with some particular counties actually having record dry. So I think the statewide numbers there, at least for the Carolinas, the statewide numbers do not really reflect how dry it was in the interior portions of both those states. You had the mitigating factor there, the heavier rain from Dorian. So what made this drought so bad, quite honestly, is had a double whammy, if you will, of driest September on record, along with the top 5 warm September, and that, and along with, and of course the first 10 days of October have only exacerbated things. So this map here is also from NCEI, and it shows the statewide temperatures across, by state across the United States. You can see portions of a lot of states to the west, New Mexico, Louisiana, et cetera, had the record warmest September on record. But 123 would be the 3rd warmest, 122 4th warmest, 121 5th warmest. So 125 years of record goes back to 1895. So basically, every state in our region, or every state south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River, had a top 5 warm September. So you factor in or you combine record dryness with top 5 heat or top 3, top 4 heat over a 4-week period, now going on about a 6-week period, and you can see how this flash drought developed. And sort of a new term, the term flash drought, they got sort of pretty much coined, I think, back in 2012 when they had a pretty significant flash drought in the northern plains in the wheat area. But anyway, so adding insult to injury, this is a 2-week temperature anomaly, and you can see the entire region from the Florida Panhandle up northward, northeastward into Virginia has had temperatures 8 to 12 degrees above normal, with a few splotches there, that's the red, a few splotches of 12 to 16 degrees above normal there across the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. And this here map here shows the number of days that have seen temperatures above 95 degrees in the past 30 days. And portions of central Georgia here, Macon, Columbus, 20 days, Montgomery, Alabama, 22. So basically 200 every 3 days have had temperatures above 95 degrees across a lot of the region. Even here into Virginia, you can see 5 days at Richmond. It looks like about 5 there, 3 to 5 there in the Roanoke area. So this heat has been continuing into October, and this image here is from the Southeast Regional Climate Center at North Carolina State University in North Carolina. It shows the average temperatures over the past 30 days for various cities in the region. So the one would be the warmest such 30 days on record, starting September 9th, running through October 9th. So that 30-day period has been the warmest on record for a lot of real estate here from Alabama, Florida Panhandle. Tallahassee had its warmest ever, up there into the western portions of Virginia, actually even up into the DC area. And a lot of other areas had second or third warmest. So in general, record warmth the past 30 days, starting September 9th or so, when things first started ramping up that first week of September. You combine record warmth with record dryness, obviously not a good combination. So let's look here at some of the state impacts. We got these reports here from the state climate offices of these various states. The main impacts and sort of the state responses from North Carolina. As you see, there are many areas in the interior portions that had less than a 1/4 inch of rainfall in the past month. General impacts have been plants, agriculture, things of that nature. For South Carolina, they have a drought response committee team, which meets, I believe, every couple of weeks or so. And their next meeting is October 17th. You can see some of their statistics there. The statewide rainfall for September was about 1.8 inches. Once again, a lot of that was confined to the coast with Dorian. And even with that, it was still less than 50% of normal. Normal should be 4.24. So they got about, looks like about 40% of rainfall. You can see a lot of the counties there in the interior and western portions of South Carolina are listed as being in moderate drought, incipient drought to moderate drought. And they're already starting to see some problems with stream flows. The Corps of Engineers declared first drought level for the entire Savannah River Basin, which is the river there that borders South Carolina and Georgia. In the Virginia area, the stream flows have not been too bad yet. The stream flows tend to be a lagging indicator of drought. Usually agriculture and an increase in forest fires or forestry impacts are your first sectors to sort of take it on the chin, if you will. So stream flows in general not too bad for Virginia, although the central and the coastal sections are not too good. The reds there are the bottom 10 percentile this time of year. So stream flows eastern third of the state are bottom 10% for this time of year, bottom 25% pretty much in the central portion of the state. And it looks like the mountain regions or the Appalachian is still doing pretty good with stream flows near normal. And so the Virginia Drought Monitoring Task Force is ramping up, starting to assess things and look at things. The state of Georgia, I know the state climatologist there has had a lot of briefings with the Environmental Protection Division. The image here on the lower right was part of their briefing, and it's a neat image. It shows the 4-week change in the drought monitor. And you can see the darker browns there are 3-category degradation. So basically these dark brown areas here, a lot of them in Georgia, some of them in the Carolinas, have gone from no drought whatsoever to extreme drought or D3. in a 4-week period. And that's that 3-class degradation. There's a little swath here around Marianna, Florida, near Jackson County, which looks like actually a 4-class degradation. So it went from D, no drought at all, to D3. Whereas these Georgia counties pretty much went from the 3-category degradation would be no drought to D2. And once again, stream flows here starting to look pretty bad. The most significant one is the Flint River near Carsonville, which is right here, just northwest of my box. It's right there to the west of the Macon area. It's sort of the headwaters of the Flint River. The stream flow today, 98 years of record from the USGS, and the stream flow today, the discharge 72 CFS was the lowest ever on record for this date. So a little bit surprising to see some of the hydrology impacts ramping up as quickly as they have been. But I guess once again, that's due to the not only the dryness, but also the record heat. The state of Alabama, their Office of Water Resources has got 3 of their 9 climate divisions under a drought warning. The next time they meet, I think it's in another week or 2, you'll probably see these things deteriorate even more. So they've also been very proactive in assessing the situation and taking steps and measures to mitigate things. So real quick, my last couple of slides here, sort of why, what caused this pattern. The main thing would be been a persistent ridge of high pressure. The map on the left here shows a 500 millibar anomaly for the month of September, from September 1st through 9/28. You can see a big area here. It's centered, actually looks like over Cape Girardeau, Missouri or so, or Paducah, Kentucky. You see a big area of above normal heights across this area, which does extend into the southeast U.S. Below normal heights here, the Pacific Northwest. You can sort of picture perhaps a jet stream running here, from Southern California on up across the northern plains into southeast Canada, and then coming back around. So this area here had been very wet. They've been on the east side of that trough. We saw the record wetness there in North Dakota. Southeast U.S., not the case. The image on the right shows the average relative humidities at 1,000 millibars for the month of September. You can see all the dryness. This is, you can see the huge the percent composite and anomaly here across the southeast U.S. Once again, all the wetness here in the northern plains. And another factor I want to point out too, actually David Zierden, the state climatologist for Florida, mentioned this in one of the in the bi-weekly Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint DEWS webinars that we have. There's been, ever since Dorian, so here's the track of Dorian right here. And this was, of course, Labor Day weekend, the first week of September. But since then, there's just been a plethora of tropical cyclones, named tropical cyclones, that have sort of drifted from south to north up off the east coast of Florida, staying, except for Dorian, which just barely impacted the coast of the Carolinas. These features have stayed far enough offshore not to bring any precip to the southeast U.S., but at the same time, the southeast U.S. is in the dry west side, or the subsident west side. We have sinking motion to the west side of these storms. So here's Barry right in here, which developed, I believe, there in July. It brought some rainfall to Louisiana and Arkansas. And then here is Imelda right here. So no tropical cyclones whatsoever impacting the southeast U.S. this year. And that, obviously, that's one of the reasons why, as we approach the end of the tropical cyclone season, Atlantic Basin hurricane season, where we have the drought. And quite honestly, the very similar type of pattern that I just described is going on right now. Here's the 5-day outlook from the National Hurricane Center. You can see there's 2 systems we're looking at right now. They have a very low probability of becoming a tropical cyclone, but nonetheless, they do have, strong, decent winds and some tropical characteristics with them. Once again, off the east coast of the United States. And in the lower right here is a water vapor satellite image from yesterday afternoon. And you can see here's your tropical systems up in here that's causing the nor'easter in the northeast U.S. or New England today and tomorrow. And you can see in general the swath of clouds offshore, and the dark areas here are areas of extreme dryness or sinking motion. You can see that covers the entire east coast from Virginia down through Georgia, into the Florida Panhandle. You can see there's been deep trough in the Pacific Northwest, and you can see the jet stream doing this up into the northern plains. So really, that map I showed for the month of September, as far as the anomalies right here, that's still pretty much this pattern, this general pattern, is still holding true, even this week. And that pattern should be breaking here very soon, so that's the good news. And I will turn over to Pam. She has more specific details and information on the agricultural impacts.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slides. Oops, it's asking me if I want to leave the webinar. Not a good idea. All right. I'm the agricultural climatologist at the University of Georgia, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. You can go back and look at them later. They're germinate properly, so that's move these slides forward. It keeps asking me if I want to leave the webinar, so you might have to.
I'll take care.
Thank you. Early impacts of drought. You saw Victor talked about the Drought Monitor. I think it's probably fair to say the Drought Monitor was underestimating the amount of drought that were actually occurring. It's very typical that the Drought Monitor doesn't catch these short-term droughts. And some of the places in Georgia were recording problems with forage as early as July 1st. So some of those dry areas that really didn't even show up that well on the Drought Monitor were areas that there were already a lot of problems with drought. Some people that had corn out that was pollinating at the time that we had those dry conditions had trouble filling their ears. You can see an example here of what those ears look like when they're not properly pollinated. And so the yields go down because you have a lot of open spaces in those ears. And so some of that was seen also in the drought of 2016, where there was a 3-week dry spell that just pretty much wiped out corn in the northwest part of Georgia. So here the first signs of it were this difficulty pollinating, and then also having to feed livestock as early as July 1 because there was just no hay growing. So let's go on. It's always important to keep in mind that drought isn't always a bad thing. There's a couple of agricultural groups that really like dry weather, and one is the wine grapes. They like the dry weather. Almost all the vines are irrigated, so it's not really an issue of how much rainfall. They like the dry conditions because it concentrates the sugar in the grapes and it reduces fungal diseases, so they get better yields. So they're loving the hot weather. Also for areas that are irrigated and they've got sufficient water, the dry conditions are good for harvest because they don't have to worry about the cotton getting soggy, and then the ground is, if it's irrigated, they can soften the ground enough to harvest peanuts as well. But most of the impacts have been negative. Let's go on. And I'm just going to go through this. It's important to keep in mind, too, that today is the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Michael. It caused tremendous damage in agriculture in the southeast, especially in Georgia. And some of those effects are still being seen today. In addition to all the losses of timber and pecan orchards in the state, we also had trees that are still standing, but had a lot of damage, either to the roots because the trees were vibrating and that pulled the roots loose, or bark damage because the trees were twisting in the wind and caused a lot of cracks. So there's a lot of disease and damage to trees that are still standing that we really have not reckoned with yet. And the drought, of course, has just made that worse. And we'll see that later when we talk about forest fires. Infrastructure for peanuts and other crops have all not been replaced yet. In fact, a lot of places haven't even gotten relief money yet because of Congress. And so that's been a real issue. I'm going to start now on the next slide talking about impacts on different crops in the southeast. This is generally true across the southeast. I do have some extra slides for a couple of the states at the end. On corn and cotton, most of the corn was already harvested, and so there's a limited impacts on that, except, as I pointed out, the pollination problems. And dryland corn also had more trouble establishing. For people that are planting corn after something else, right now it's very hard to get the corn to germinate properly, so that's an issue as well. Cotton for many places was near the harvest in most locations, similar to last year with Michael when it all blew away. For cotton, dry conditions are not really a problem for most farmers as long as the bowls are full. But defoliants don't work very well when it's really, really dry, and so they have to follow a different routine for applying defoliants. It gets the leaves off, makes it easier to harvest the cotton. Next slide talks about what's going on with peanuts, which of course is another big crop here in the southeast and especially in Georgia. About half the peanuts in Georgia are irrigated. Those were generally doing okay. In fact, they were a little ahead of usual development because we had so much sunshine. No clouds, so more sunshine, everything was developing very quickly. For those peanuts, the harvest is proceeding at a pretty good pace. The irrigation can keep the soils moist enough and soft enough that it's not too hard to get the peanuts out. But for folks that do dryland peanuts, the soil was really crusty and hard, and when they try to take the peanuts out, they leave a lot of the nuts behind in the soil, so the yields go way down. So they really were hoping for rain, and they were holding off on trying to harvest because they were hoping for some rain to soften the soil so they'd get better yields. But our peanuts are irrigated. Those were generally doing, for those peanuts, the harvest, then you also lose points for the quality. And so either you have better yield and poor quality, or you have a lesser yield but better quality. So it's really an economic decision. At this point, I think most people are trying to harvest where they can. Next slide talks about what's going on with fruits. Of course, fruits here, we talk about Georgia peaches, but actually blueberry is a bigger crop in the southeast, especially in Georgia. When it gets really hot, the blueberry plants do not do well. The stomas on the leaves just close up and everything just kind of struggles. A lot of blueberries have drip irrigation down at the roots, and they just can't put out enough water to deal with the water demands that we've been having with these really high temperatures and low humidities. Turns out that for a drought, the overhead irrigation, you can see a picture here, is better for cooling, keeps those temperatures down, and also covers a better percentage of the blueberry plant fields. And so you can really see, in this case, those overhead irrigation is probably better for irrigation. But of course, it does waste more water because a lot of that is evaporated into the dry air, and so you have some loss that way. Peaches have also very high water demands. This time of year is really not a production time for peaches, but what happens now is going to affect what we have over the winter and for next year. So it's really not early enough to say what impacts that's going to be. It would not surprise me if we're going to see some reduced yields in peaches next year and probably some more issues with the trees just because the drought is putting such stress on them. Next slide talks about pecans, which of course is another big industry here in the southeast. The dry conditions are, some producers are reporting that some nuts are dropping. It's kind of like a natural abortion for the tree. It tries to save a smaller amount of nuts and keep water going to those nuts as they fill out. They're seeing leaf drop in a lot of the plants, especially those that are being stressed by Hurricane Michael. Most irrigators can put some water on the trees, but they can't replace the entire demands. If you're only getting 1/10 of an inch, then you're going to have trouble providing all of the water needs for the plants. The irrigation is really designed to be supplemental, and so that's been a problem. They're also starting to see some problems with nuts sprouting on the trees, which reduces quality and makes it impossible to sell, at least not to sell at any good price. And so that's something that the pecan growers are really worried about as well. Next slide talks about what's going on with vegetables. A lot of vegetable production in Florida. A lot of that is irrigated, so this is more for dryland vegetables. The heat is bad for pollination. They just don't set as many vegetables as they might otherwise. And it also is really good for the development of whiteflies. Whiteflies are a pest here in the southeast that transmits viruses, which is a real problem because it causes a lot of damage to the plants. It reduces the yield as well. Evapotranspiration demands require more frequent irrigation because they're not getting water any other way. The problem is if you put too much water on it, pulls nutrients out of the soil and they're not available for plants. And another problem that I was really surprised at was that you would think that the lower humidity might reduce fungal diseases, and that would be a good thing. But it turns out that when you do all this irrigation, you're actually causing more problems for fungal diseases. And so then they have to figure out how to treat them, or they lose production that way. So that was a surprise to me that the irrigation is causing more problems with diseases than if you just have the drought. Next slide talks about what's going on with forests. I see in my own backyard that my trees are starting to drop leaves already, and that's happening all across the region. The trees are trying to conserve whatever moisture they can. So it's already fall. They're just hurrying up the fall process a little bit more. This is definitely seeing a drastic increase in the number of wildflowers. It's not as bad as 2016 was yet, but definitely in certain parts of the drought area, wildfires have gone way up. The impacts for next year really are going to depend what happens this winter. If this flash drought does go away, then some producers are reporting that some nuts hit. But if it transitions into a hydrologic or long-term drought, then we could really see even more problems next year for the forest. So that's something we're going to be watching very closely over the winter. Next slide talks about probably the single biggest problem with drought this year, and that's been impacts on hay and forage. I mentioned earlier that we were having people already having to feed hay to their livestock as early as July 1. And a lot of pastures and hay fields have just completely stopped growing, which means that they haven't been able to put their cattle out to eat on the naturally growing grass, but they're having to feed them already. That's feed that they're not going to have for next winter. It's feed that they're not going to be able to sell either. If some people sell that, they can't use their pastures. And so economically, it's going to be a huge loss. A lot of livestock producers are already having to cull their cattle. And that means, there's going to be a lot of meat on the market, which means the prices of meat will probably go down. And prices of hay are certainly going to go up as there's more demand for it. A lot of farmers have lost their last cutting of hay for the summer. Some could still expect another one before the fall frost comes, especially if you're in the southern part of the region. But at this rate, I don't really see that we're going to get any real growth of the grass. And so that's going to be an issue. Hay quality is also more variable when it's dry. The nutrient levels in the hay will vary quite a bit. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind as well. And another thing is, these dry conditions are also preventing people from planting their fall usual planting of winter pastures and small grains. When it's this dry, you put the seeds in the ground and they just sit there. They don't germinate. And so that's really not good. At some point, if it continues to be dry, it's going to be too late for the plants to actually grow before the frost hits and everything goes back to dormancy for the winter. And so that means they're going to lose potentially a crop over the winter as well. And that's something to keep in mind. Next slide shows the impacts, as I mentioned, on livestock. Of course, we don't have hay. We're going to have the impacts on livestock. The cattle are under a lot of stress. They're not getting enough water. The feed, of course, people try to take care of their animals, and so they're supplementing with grain and other nutrients that keep the cattle going. Water supplies are drying up. There's a picture here of a stream that somebody sent me. It's only the second time. They said they've lived in this place for maybe 30 or 40 years. It's only the second time they've seen the stream completely dry up like this. And a lot of producers depend on those water sources to help water their animals. So if you don't have that water, you got to figure out how you're going to bring it in. Water quality problems as that water dries up also become more of an issue. You have algal blooms, which can cause toxic problems, or some of the livestock, and so that's becoming more of an issue as well. Farmers are having to get rid of their cattle because they want to be able to keep the best cattle in a manageable number for the amount of watering they have to do and amount of feed that they have to do. So the prices for beef and probably not as much pork, because a lot of that is grown in the area that's been wetter, will probably rise due to the higher costs of feeding hay. The next slide talks about some of the impacts that we've seen in North Carolina, and these are just some quotes from the weekly weather and crop bulletin. You can probably go back and look at this later because I don't want to spend too much time on it now. Just talking about very dry conditions across the area and delayed winter grain planting, just really no moisture in the soils at all. And so also an increase in armyworms, which really like the dry conditions and can cause problems for some crops in the area. Next slide talks about agricultural impacts in South Carolina. See, even as far back as August, when it wasn't really that dry yet, they were having some problems with soybeans and cotton. We go on to the next slide. It talks about September and some of the slides there. You can see how dry it is. You can see the ponds that are drying up. They're having problems with wildlife incursions coming in because the wildlife, like deer, are looking for water as well, so they'll come wherever it is. So there's a lot more wildlife incursions than there used to be, and the pastures are just dry. The next slide shows some of the October impacts. Just heartbreaking to read some of these stories, and I've gotten many phone calls from beef cattle producers that are saying we just have never seen it this bad, and we've had no rain at all for 6 weeks or more. So next slide talks about monitor really just isn't catching how bad this drought has gotten and how quickly it's happened. Flash droughts aren't really caught very well by the drought monitor, and unfortunately it means they're kind of playing catch up after that. Next slide talks about the impacts in Florida. I talked to David Zierden in Florida. He says in Florida, because a lot of vegetable crops are pretty high value, most of the crops are irrigated, and so they haven't had as much issues just because of the irrigation, other than the problems I've said with fungal diseases, overwetting. A lot of Florida is not even covered by D0 yet, and so of course they're not really seeing any impacts at this time. Next slide. This is a summary of what I just talked about. We've seen some limited benefits from the dry weather for a few crops. Probably the worst hit so far have been the forage and livestock, and probably the peanuts as well. Again, the dryland peanuts are really the issue there. There's a lot we don't know about what's going to happen next year. There's latent problems in other crops they're stressing was yet, but that they're going to have problems in the next spring putting out fruit or nuts. And so those are something that we really don't know what's going to happen yet. It depends a lot on what happens over the winter and whether we get rain this winter. If we don't, it's going to be more of a problem next year, but it's really too early to say that. Victor will talk about that more in just a minute. And as I mentioned, the drought monitor does not adequately capture the drought conditions in terms of agricultural impacts. Now, we haven't seen as many impacts so far on water supply. It takes a lot longer time period to really see big effects in the water supply. So that hasn't shown up as much. But it means the media doesn't really pay that much attention either. And so that's a shortfall that we really just have to deal with. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Victor at this point for an outlook.
Thank you, Pam. Okay, the image here is the latest 7-day precipitation forecast from the National Weather Service Weather Prediction Center, and it shows actually shows some pretty good news here over the next 7 days. You can see a swath here of a cold front moves through the area over the weekend. You can see a swath here of purples of 1.5 inches. So a swath here 1.5 inches plus across North Georgia, which would be very beneficial. I believe that area is in extreme drought right now, D3. And that swath of heavier precip does continue east into the Carolinas. So I think short term, good news for most of the area. I guess the one area that, at least for right now, for the first week, looks like it may not share in the wealth would be the southern third of Georgia, and of course North Florida, where drought's still pretty significant there. And it also looks like Virginia also. So over the next week at least, I would say improvements, some rainfall coming in, some much needed rainfall coming in for most of Alabama, North Georgia, into the Carolinas. Perhaps not so much. Amounts here less than a quarter inch across the southern third of Georgia, all of North Florida, the I-10 corridor, as well as Virginia. So sort of a mixed bag there, although I think probably more good news than bad news in general, since the sort of the core drought areas are getting at least a forecast to see 1 to 2 inches of rainfall. The exception would be, of course, southern third of Georgia and the Florida Panhandle. What about week 2? On the left is the most recent week 2 forecast from the Climate Prediction Center, and it does show a 50% probability of above normal rainfall, big area there from about Nashville, Tennessee, southward to about New Orleans. It's looking pretty high confidence that there will be a above normal rainfall across Louisiana and Arkansas next week, perhaps even heavy rain. I guess the question is, how far east does that heavier rainfall come? CPC is showing for week 2, the green area there, about a 40 to 50% probability of increased chances for rainfall. So if you add in that plus the near normal rainfall, looks like about about a 70 to 75% chance of at or above normal rainfall for week 2 for the entire region. So that will be the period from October 17th through the 23rd. Once again, 70 to 75% probability of at least near normal to above normal rainfall. And the image on the right is an experimental deterministic forecast for week 2. It's very difficult to forecast deterministically, rainfall amounts or precip amounts in the week 2 time period. But this is done by the folks at the Earth Systems Research Lab out in Boulder, Colorado. And the yellows there are 1 to 2 inches. So you can see here in that week 2 time period, I can see a lot of 1 to 2 inch rainfall totals again across Alabama, Georgia, across the Carolinas, and actually some 2 to 4 inch, some scattered 2 to 4 inch totals there also. So I think it's looking pretty high confidence there'll be heavy rain in the lower Mississippi River Valley next weekend or in that week 2 time period, and that should be spreading eastward into the southeast U.S. looks like next weekend. So short term, next week or 2, I think things are looking up for most of the region. Once again, the outliers might be North Florida there, surprisingly enough. But I would think for the next couple of weeks at least, drought conditions should at least stabilize starting this weekend into the middle part of next week once the next rain event starts. I think the drought conditions should stabilize, if not improve slightly, at least over the next 2 weeks. The big factor there is the change in that upper air pattern. Those tropical systems that are hanging off the East Coast, the system that's there right now, southeast of Cape Cod and New England, it finally moves away this weekend. Is with it moving away, that high pressure ridge of the southeast U.S. sort of moves away. So I think we'll get back to more of a normal, quote unquote, upper air pattern starting this weekend. And I think based on that, we'll see near normal to above normal rainfall for the next 2 weeks. Big question is how about after that? And starting in the week 3, week 4 time period, things do start to get murky. The Climate Prediction Center, they do release now every Friday afternoon, and I'm really curious to see what their forecast shows tomorrow. Every Friday afternoon, they issue a week 3, week 4 outlook, which goes out for that week 3, week 4 time period. On the right is the most recent forecast, and it's a week old. It was made last Friday, so anytime a forecast is a week old, it might be a little bit dated, but that's what it shows. I think tomorrow's forecast hopefully will be a little bit more positive with regards to probability of above normal rainfall for the southeast U.S. On the left is the latest coupled forecast system model from Weather Service, which shows a week 3, week 4 time period. And it actually shows a little bit of a tilt towards wetness for the southeast U.S., both in week 3 and the week 4 time period, which would be the last week of October and the first week of November. So basically, good news in my recap or my summary slide here. I think good news for the next 2 weeks. I think we'll see drought conditions begin to ameliorate somewhat. We'll have several cool fronts coming through the area, so at least temperatures should be getting closer to near normal instead of this ridiculous warmth like we've been seeing. And then I think we'll see at or above normal precip for the next 2 weeks. And then things do get murky in that week 3 to 4 time period. And like I said, I'd really encourage everyone to make a point. I think the forecast comes out about 2 to 3 p.m. on Friday afternoons. So take a peek at that CPC week 3, week 4 outlook tomorrow, which should take you through the middle of November, at least the first 10 days or so of November. And stay tuned. I think I'll hand it back to Meredith. I think she has some overall housekeeping items. And go ahead, Meredith.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Victor. You told an excellent story of how we got into this situation, as well as an outlook for what we should be looking for in the next couple of weeks. And then thank you, Pam, to really hammer home the first line of drought impacts being agriculture and the nuances of different aspects of agriculture and forestry. It was great. And now Victor pulled in some impact information also from different states. I'm going to now walk very quickly
the best cattle and a manageable number
information and provide some links of where you can get additional details. I will, so if you'd like to take a screenshot, please do it fairly quickly. And then again, this will all be released after and accessible after the webinar. So Virginia has a drought monitoring task force, which is an interagency group that focuses on conditions and making recommendations. They also have drought status reports that are periodically released. Here's a link where you can access those. In North Carolina, there is a Drought Management Advisory Council. They do meet weekly, regardless of if there's a drought or not, and you can visit this website. It's an excellent website that has a lot of information on current status, conditions, as well as general educational resources as well. South Carolina has a Drought Response Committee. Again, an excellent website that you can go to find out information on the process, the current drought conditions, and other resources relevant to
Talks about some
Georgia, some great resources at the Georgia State Climatologist Office. Here's the link. It's in the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. If you'd like a little more background on drought management in Georgia, we also provided a link, and you can find some drought indicator reports there. Alabama has another state with a very thorough process of drought planning and management. In particular, there's an Alabama Monitoring and Impact Group that meets on a regular basis to assess the situation and provide that to the government of Alabama to inform drought declarations, and there's a link there. And then finally, Florida, there is the Climate Center does a great job. A couple of times already we've mentioned the state climatologist. You can also reach out to the Florida Water Management Districts. There's links here. And also we provided a link to burn ban information to find out what areas are currently under bans. At scaling up to the regional level in the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint River Basin,
just really
early warning system at a regional level. There are monthly drought webinars, and there's a link here to sign up for those that focus on this area, and they really get into a little bit more detail in terms of reservoir levels, etc. And during drought, these are now bi-weekly. So they just had one last week, and there'll be another one next week. There's also some regional amount of information that is brought into those webinars. Scaling back a little farther up to the southeast, there's a whole host. I won't walk through these, but USDA, Southeast Regional Climate Center, National Weather Service, both the River Forecast Center and to identify your local forecast office. I'm going to do a plug for Pam Knox, our great presenter, who has a really great Southeast Climate and Agriculture blog you can sign up to. And then, of course, a couple more links for general information, including the U.S. Drought Monitor and the U.S. Drought Portal. Last two slides, the U.S. Drought Monitor, which has been mentioned a few times, both in slides, does have an online tutorial. It's a really great product brought to you by USDA, National Drought Mitigation Center, NIDIS. Encourage you to look at it if you have questions about how the monitor is developed and utilized. And finally, USDA has just this week put out a new fact sheet that summarizes drought-related programs through USDA. I know we have a strong agricultural impact focus of this particular webinar, so this might be of interest. There's the link, and it lists a whole suite of different resources that many of you may find valuable. So once again, if you have questions, please enter them into the question box. This will be recorded and posted on drought.gov. We'll send out a note to those who registered where you can find that. Also, early next week, we will put together a synthesis, a 1- or 2-page document that highlights the big take-home messages of today with some nice visuals. If you'd like some slides, feel free to email me. Also, please, when you close out of the webinar, there will be a survey. This is our first time doing a Southeast-wide drought webinar. We would be really interested to hear from you if you found this useful, what we could do differently to help you in your decisions and where you work. Perhaps some additional topics could be focused on in the future related to water resources or wildfire, etc. So please take a moment to provide that input. And if you have any questions at all, I've listed here the emails for the speakers, Victor, Pam, and then of course myself. We can go ahead and try to feed those out as appropriate. Now, I see we have quite a few questions, and we only have about 5 more minutes left. What we'll do is, for those questions we don't get to, we have your email. We will respond to you directly offline and answer that question and provide you with any follow-up information as needed. Also, let me see how I can get to this. Okay, here we go. And if we don't get to you, we'll make sure we get back to you. Okay, first question is from Puneet in Alabama. would you say, is this going in order? I think this is. Would you say that the high pressure system centered in Missouri was blessing, protected us from Dorian, and curse, responsible for the current flash drought, or both? I think that's a good question for you, Victor.
Yeah, I would say both, Meredith. The high pressure keeps good news. It keeps away tropical cyclones. Bad news is, in the summertime at least, the southeast U.S. tropical cyclones, of unknown intensity. Obviously, something like Dorian, as far as the tremendous wind speeds goes, or something like Imelda or Harvey, where it just doesn't move at all, or even Alberto, I think, in the mid 90s in Georgia. That's the curse of these things. So, sort of a mixed bag, depends how you look at it. But yeah, absolutely, the high pressure kept. The high pressure range, at least the month of September, which is the most active month of the year for Atlantic Basin, has kept the southeast high and dry, if you will.
Great, thank you, Victor. Okay, our next question is from Steve Morgan. And this looks like it's related to Drought Impact Monitor. With respect to the Drought Monitor, I am in West Central Georgia on the Alabama line. I've tried to enter reports into the Drought Impact Reporter. It took the first 2 reports, but none of the others I tried to enter will show up. Do these reports actually impact decisions on drought conditions in areas of the state? And is there any place we can document the severity of the drought in our area? And then it goes into a few details. Thank you, Pam.
Yeah, I talked to the Drought Impact Reporter people about that. They said part of the problem is that when you enter a report, if you just put in the name of the county, all the reports stack up on top of each other, so it just looks like there's one dot, even though there might be 20 reports. So you can improve that a little bit if you can put a location in. But they did say that they had some problems with the drought impact. They look at it. They look at the climate information, like the precipitation deficits and so on, but they do look at the impacts, and I think we've really woken them up to the fact that this drought is bad by putting in those impact reports. And so there's a couple different ways you can see them. They're not very useful, I think, in a lot of ways, especially if they're piling the dots up right on top of each other. But they do get looked at, and I think that does go into their decision-making process, although it's nothing that you say in there is going to outweigh what they see in the maps that Victor has shown today.
Great, thank you, Pam. The next question, we have a couple of people sharing information. We can share that as well. You can see that in the discussion box. This might be best for Victor. How does the current drought situation in central, western North Carolina and South Carolina compare to recent droughts, such as those over the past 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In general, it's sort of difficult to get drought in these areas because it's just not that common. It tends to get a lot of rainfall. The one that jumps out at me would be I think it's 2016 drought, which they had just tremendous wildfires there across the southern Appalachians, and of course the major fire there in the Gatlinburg area. I believe that was 2016. That one was a lot more long lasting. I believe that drought actually started maybe in the winter or spring of 16, and it did indeed last all summer long. And then it came to a head, I think, around Thanksgiving in November, and then things quickly got wet and turned back to normal. So that one was longer, lasted 6 to 9 months in duration. Right now, we're talking 6 to 9 weeks. So that one was worse, longer, and I think ultimately the impacts were, worse, at least from a forestry perspective, which is more of a longer term issue. And then from an agricultural perspective, I really don't remember. I don't think it had perhaps extreme heat that we're seeing right now, but obviously it was a long hot summer, I'm sure. Maybe Pam can chime in on the agriculture impacts of that 2016 drought, because it did affect a lot of Georgia too.
Yeah, it certainly caused problems first in the northeast or the northwest part of the state with the corn. Yields generally across the state were down by 30% or more. Actually started in the summer or late spring of 2016, and it was kind of low key until September. And then in September, it ramped up very quickly, similar to this year. And by November, it was just really toasty. And then we got some rain then that dropped things back, although there were a lot of hydrologic impacts already still that were around in the spring of 2017. But I came here in 2001 and we were in a drought then. We've had droughts 2007 to 2009, 2011 to 2013, and then the 2016 drought. So these things that happen at relatively frequent intervals, and it's happened more since the temperatures have been rising. And so I think this continuation of more frequent droughts, unfortunately, is probably likely to continue in the future.
Thank you, Pam. I would also encourage you to reach out using the links we provided to the state climatologist office in South Carolina and North Carolina. They have some really great tools for also examining the historical context if you'd like additional information. And the last question I have here is providing these slides after the webinar via an email. Absolutely. It's on this sheet right now. Just email me directly at Meredith Muth. And I think, is there any more questions? Wait, we have one more. Wait, we got a couple more. Does this drought follow any sort of pattern? I'm not quite sure what that means, but Victor?
Well, I think the pattern, if you will, that it follows would be, when you have a big ridge of high pressure sitting over an area, whether it be Texas, as we saw here in 2011, or the southeast U.S., like you're seeing right now. Anytime you have a big high pressure dome over you, precip tends to disappear. And of course, unfortunately, anytime you have precip disappearing in, August or September, or in this case, even the first 10 days of October, you basically, the hot temperatures will come. Rainfall is a beautiful cooling mechanism in the late summer, in the summertime, and the early fall. So the big ridge sitting over the southeast U.S. would be the one clear pattern associated with this. And I think of interest, maybe there'll be some research papers or some peer-reviewed papers to come. But just the way all these tropical cyclones just kept tracking up the east coast, off the east coast of the United States this year, it was really interesting. Just kept on, if you will, reinforcing that ridge over the southeast U.S. Like I said, that ridge is still sitting there right now, today, as I showed in those last few maps today. But finally this weekend, that starts to weaken and abate as that big sort of a non-tropical or sort of a hybrid between tropical and non-tropical low pressure area off the southeast coast of New England right now. That thing finally weakens and moves away this coming weekend. I think when that occurs early next week, we'll see this change that I'm referring to, and this pattern that will finally disappear or go away.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's it for questions. And I just want to thank you again on behalf of NIDIS and all the partners in the region for joining us today to discuss and learn a bit about drought in the Southeast. And many thanks to our excellent presenters, Victor Murphy and Pam Knox. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, Meredith.
Thanks, Meredith. We'll talk to you later.